Hello, Chris. Good morning, and thank you for joining this session with me on the cloud security. So a lot of my subscribers were asking about like how cloud security works, and then what is it that it is different? How is it different from on-premise security? And I think there's no better person than you who can talk more about the cloud security, because I have seen it, like how you have done it in an enterprise company. And like we were joking around, like you are one of the dinosaurs of this space, in this space. So could you please give some introduction about yourself, or what have you been doing these days?
Sure, sure. No, I appreciate you having me on and giving me a chance and an opportunity to talk to yourself and your viewers about this incredibly interesting and growing topic. Cloud security has been around for what, 5-10 years or so, and of late, it's really something that almost every single enterprise is diving into, whether it be from an IaaS perspective or a SaaS perspective. Pretty much every company, every major company in the world is involved in cloud.
Yep.
How I got into it. So I started my career many years ago, and out of college, one of my interests was development and technology. So I started coding, and I worked for banks, financial services.
Mm-hmm.
And I brought in a perspective to banking that I don't think they had at the time, and that was using code to support. And I was in audit at the time, and I was doing technology auditing for maybe the first 14 years of my career. But I was leveraging automation to do the coding. So I was always thinking automation. How can I look and search across entire databases for exceptions rather than sample and do a random sample of 40 things and find exceptions? I would write a piece of code and scan the entire master file and pull out whatever the exceptions were and identify them all.
Right.
So that mentality kind of stayed with me. I moved from auditing into security in banking, and then into other financial services companies.
Mm-hmm.
And focused again on technology auditing, identifying where system risks were, and then leveraging automation to support the work that I was doing. Transitioning into information security, doing similar things, building what we used to call early warning systems, but again, leveraging automation. So automation has really been a theme of my career. And then as the cloud became more and more interesting to companies, I started working with it. And I was asked by the company I worked with to start looking at the cloud and
Mm-hmm.
building out a cloud security architecture. So that's what we did. And we started with AWS. But again, it was hands to the keyboard. I was a very senior leader, but I always had interest in having hands to the keyboard experience. And so I started with AWS. I was building VPCs, building subnets, a lot of my CIDR blocks, and then building CloudFormation templates and managing IAM, and then really getting into the meat of AWS. And that's really how things got kicked off. After that, I started building teams, right? Security teams that would just focus on cloud. And that's what I'm doing today. I'm building, in the company that I just joined in October, CVS Health. I'm building a security team to focus on cloud security. And typically, I look at cloud security in any cloud. They're all essentially the same. I mean, the nomenclature is different, but they're all pretty similar. But I look at it from 4 verticals. I look at it from an engineering vertical where you have to have coders, preferably Python coders or Bash coders or PowerShells, whatever. You have to have architectures, solution architecting, and just regular cloud architects, and SMEs, people who know the technology.
Yep.
You need to have operations people. You need to monitor the cloud all the time, constant compliance monitoring. And then you need this thing called governance, right? What's the policies? What's the procedures? What's the controls? And identifying where the controls need to be enhanced or written or documented. And those are the 4 areas that I really focus in on when I build a cloud security team.
Thanks, Chris. And I have seen it very closely, how you have built the team. And under your leadership, we have created an awesome cloud security, in that company, right? But how do you differentiate between the cloud security versus the traditional data center security?
Yeah, well, the cloud is a completely virtual environment. It's all automation. So in the data center, it's not so virtual. I mean, certainly we have internal clouds in VM and OpenStack and deployments, but typically a data center has brick and mortar, 4 walls. You manage everything from the network all the way up through the applications. And then when you think of a cloud, you have this whole shared responsibility model from a typical IaaS where you have a third party. It's more like a colo, if you would think, where you have a third party that's managing the brick and mortar, the physical buildings. They're managing that network, that underlying network, and all the way up through the hypervisor, where then you pick up the OS on top of it. But I think that the big difference in the cloud is automation. It's fully automated. Everything's just push button. It's a push button deployment, push button management, push button everything. And a lot of the focus and emphasis in the cloud is around configuration of that infrastructure that your applications will be deployed on. In the data centers, you would have a team dedicated to building servers. You would have a team dedicated to building the network equipment. In the cloud, you really shift to this DevOps model where the developers are responsible for the infrastructure, building the servers, choosing the right server type, the right block storage. Developers will build the network componentry, all the microsegmentation. That's all the developers' responsibility, in addition to deploying their application. So it's quite a different model, and the differences result in challenges from a security perspective, for sure.
Right.
I do believe that the cloud is more secure than on-prem.
Okay.
If it is done correctly.
Okay.
It's not like that out of the box, not even close. But if you configure it right and you have the understanding of the tools and you take a defense in depth approach, you can make a cloud environment more secure than on-prem. I firmly believe that.
Okay. I think because of, you have seen it closely, you believe in that. But as you know, Chris, most of the time, some section of the people say that public cloud is very insecure, and they would still rely on the data center security, or they would have their workloads in the data center. But so one of the common misconception is that, when I speak to people, when you put your workloads on the cloud, it is secure by default in public cloud. You don't have to do anything else. But like you said, you should have the right controls. So what are the common risks that you have seen in the public cloud space in your experience?
Sure. I say the risks are really largely categorized in probably 4 areas, maybe 5 areas. But first, in these areas, these risks I've pretty much experienced at some point in my career. So I've seen them firsthand. And as you can imagine, I have relationships with the cloud providers, and I have many peers and many companies where we discuss these things, and everybody shares information. Oftentimes, it's hard to get threat intelligence, good threat intelligence about the cloud, unless you have a pretty wide network of colleagues and friends. And then you can get a lot of threat intelligence that no one really hears about. But nonetheless, what I see from the biggest risks is, number one, account compromises, like cloud account compromises. And this happens typically because of poor IAM controls, lack of focus on details, access keys that don't rotate, and somebody posts it on GitHub or a public repo or embeds it in code, and the code becomes public. And for whatever reason, an access key gets out of the company, and then somebody can pick that up and using a CLI and just come right in with that access key and have access to accounts and take it from there. Depending on what the access level is, they always typically attempt to move laterally, gain some kind of an access, increase their access levels, and then take over the account, and then lock everybody else out and do whatever they want with it. That's one. Second one is data loss. So in the cloud, as opposed to on-prem, there's ways to make things public. Public APIs are available either by default or through configurations. Typically, you're only 1 or 2 clicks away of making something public. Things like block storage, S3 in AWS or Blob in Azure or Google Cloud Storage in Google. You can make those objects public, and oftentimes people make mistakes, either directly by configuring it the wrong way and then exposing their data publicly, or by sharing data with a third party, and then the third party does a mistake, like marketing or something, and they'll put it in an S3 bucket and make it public. Either way, once it gets discovered and it hits the news, it's all over, and game over. Your name's blasted all over the news. You've been exposed.
Right.
Public data exposure also takes other forms. You can make snapshots and backup copies of databases public. And that happens. And again, it's configuration, right? And it's guardrails, configuration, and controls that prevent things like that from happening. Next type of thing is malware, crypto mining, ransomware. Those are typically things that we see come in to poor image lifecycle management. So when you get into the cloud, managing images is truly key, especially when you start thinking about containers and microservice type applications, allowing people to download rogue images from Docker Hub as an example.
Right.
Recipe for crypto mining. Or if you use one of the cloud providers and use community AMIs that anybody can share with anyone else. Typically, there's a lot of fleas in those AMIs, and things happen that probably shouldn't be happening. That's another risk. Compliance violations. So regulatory compliance, you can violate compliances very easily. I mean, you got to be very aware of what regs apply to you, whether it's PII, PCI, HIPAA, whatever the case may be. Know what the regulations are. Most regulations will require encryption in transit. If you don't force things to be encrypted in transit and you allow clear text, you're instantly in violation by using the cloud and configuring it the wrong way. And I'd say maybe the last exposure that I've seen, and I think more and more you will see this, is through SaaS providers. You're entrusting your data to third-party SaaS providers. The shared responsibility model is quite different. But those SaaS providers engage in SaaS providers. Those SaaS providers allow you to configure your data in unique ways, sometimes make it public, sometimes sharing it with the wrong people, and monitoring your data in a third-party SaaS environment is not an easy task. There's tools out there, very few, but there are some.
Right.
But that's another risk. So those are kind of the risks that I see from a cloud perspective. And then obviously I didn't get into DR and HA and loss of data corruption, and how you deploy your data from a resiliency perspective is also a key risk, right? You don't want to deploy everything in a single AZ or a single region, and then the region has an outage, and then you lose all your application connectivity for whatever the duration of the outage is. That's another risk.
Wow, that's quite a list, Chris. But so what are some of the challenges that you have faced in the terms of implementing, cloud security at an enterprise scale? Because obviously startups are smaller companies, enterprises are like huge set of mixture of business units. Each business unit have their own requirements. Like, what are the challenges that you have faced, and how difficult it is to implement cloud security at an enterprise?
So I'd say probably some of the bigger challenges that I see in the industry, not just where I work, but also in the industry, is training, right? And depending on the size of the company, but getting people trained up so they understand cloud. Cloud is like speaking a different language. It's not innate. You need to learn. You have to educate yourself. You have to train yourself. So that's probably one of the bigger challenges. The other challenge I see is, and you touched upon it, perceptions, right? So people have perceptions that the cloud is inherently secure, or it's an extension of on-premise. You hear that sometimes. And if something's got vulnerabilities on-prem, so what? Just put it in the cloud. It doesn't make it any worse, or it doesn't change the risk profile. Perceptions like that typically result in decisions around core foundational controls, and you need to make sure that you have a baseline of controls. The other thing I would say is a challenge is exceptions and exception management. Oftentimes when you go into these cloud environments, people can't comply with a particular foundational control. Encryption in transit, we'll use that one as an example. And they'll say, well, I need an exception. Well, keep in mind that exceptions don't really scale very well in a cloud environment. How do you keep track of it? And then if you have enough of them and they compound on each other, what is the ultimate result of all of those exceptions and the correlation of them together? What does it mean in terms of security? So I would say those are probably the bigger areas, is perceptions, making sure everybody's on the same playing field, training, making sure people understand the technology, and then exception management, minimize exceptions, and if at all, prohibit exceptions. Compliance is a must. And then as you mature in your cloud security program and you start forcing compliance, then the exceptions become non-existent, right? So you make people comply through automation. That's kind of the way I see cloud maturity and cloud security maturity within the cloud, is a transition from monitoring the environment, dealing with exception requests, dealing with that training issue, and then a shift to the right toward automation and enforcement, where you don't have a choice. If you don't comply, you either get deleted or you just get stopped right in your tracks.
Okay. And are there any guiding principles, Chris, in the terms of adopting cloud security?
Sure. So from a guiding principle perspective, there's a lot of them. I'll throw out a few of them. Number one is security is code. So when you think of cloud security, you need to think automation. There's no way to look at it, unless it's a very small environment. I should qualify that by saying if it's a small company, single account, 100 servers, you can manually monitor all of that.
Right.
But the companies I've worked for are very large enterprises that have huge scale. It's impossible to monitor and manage security without automation. So one of my guiding principles is just security is code. It's absolutely code. Everything's code. And anything you find that's not codified and you have a desire to see something, write code. Build the code so you can automate it. You can run it on servers or serverless. You can schedule it. You can continually look at something and look at everything, not just one thing. That's one guiding principle. Encrypt everything. That's another one. Encrypt at rest. And I advocate using native cloud encryption like KMS that the cloud providers support.
But is it okay to use the default encryption that cloud provides, or you?
No, I don't advocate default encryption, because default encryption will decrypt just on request to anyone with access to the service. Whereas customer managed keys give you more protection, and certainly protection against the cloud provider themselves. So I'm a big advocate of customer managed keys. Furthermore, a lot of the regs will, and your customers, if you're using customer data, will ask you to use customer managed keys.
Right.
So as a default, that's what we always have used, customer managed keys, but leveraging native KMS, encryption in transit, those are like table stakes type things, privileged access management, rotating access keys, just like their passwords, those foundational controls are hard requirements, absolute hard requirements. And that's a guiding principle for me. A centralized security model where your security team is under one umbrella. I think that is a very important opportunity or option, if you have that option, to build it that way.
So it's like a top-down approach, Chris, right from?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And then another guiding principle is always look to shift from detect to prevent. That's something that I have found a lot of success in my career. When you prevent issues, it's easier, cheaper, quicker than trying to detect and then get somebody to go back and fix it. So prevention I think is the model that everybody should strive for. And there's ample opportunity to use cloud native tooling for that, as well as custom coding and your own solutions for prevention.
Right. And you spoke about automation, and you have been biggest proponent of automation. You also have used a lot of automation in your career before you got into cloud security. So what role does automation play in cloud security, Chris?
Okay. So automation plays every role. So when I think of automation, I really think of it in three pieces.
Okay.
So in a mature cloud security program, automation should focus on really three primary areas. Number one is your DevOps environment. So assuming you're using some kind of Terraform or CloudFormation, and you're using pipelines, and you've configured IAM controls to say to the development teams, you have to use automation, right? Which I would advocate for, because if you're doing things through the console, it's the problem. But assuming you have those type of pipelines in place and everything is done through DevOps, through automations, you build security as plugins to those pipelines. So you start doing infrastructure as code scanning. You're scanning Terraform. You're scanning CloudFormation. You're looking for compliance to security policy in the code itself before it deploys.
Right.
That's one step. That's one vertical of automation. Another vertical of automation is monitoring. Monitoring takes many forms. So using a third-party tool to do continuous type monitoring that scans APIs maybe every hour, that's one piece of it. And I would advocate that because it gives you a consistent benchmark across everything, especially in a multi-cloud environment. But then augment that with custom code. So you might look at every trust in AWS to an account that's external to your AWS accounts, which can be indicative of SaaS environments or somebody setting up something inappropriate. That's something you're not going to see in a third-party tool, but you could write that code and then run it periodically once a day. The other thing we did with custom code is build dashboards, right? So you can scan encryption of everything, anything, cache, databases, AMIs, block storage, object storage, and then build dashboards. You should be 100% compliant all the time. Well, are you? And start reporting that. So that's another form of just monitoring. And then the last piece is auto remediation. So build automation that is typically triggered on create API events. So when something's created in the environment, you want to run out there and scan it. So if somebody creates a database, you want to check it, make sure it's configured with a private IP, it's encrypted with a KMS CMK, and it's enforcing encryption in transit as an example. So as soon as you see database XYZ create API, you trigger some code, Python code, whatever, and you can run that in serverless environments, so it's very inexpensive. You could scan it, and if it's compliant, you let it go. If it's non-compliant, you kill it, you delete it. Send an email back to the owner on the tag or something, say, hey, we just deleted your infrastructure because of XYZ. So that has a couple of benefits to it. So number one, keeps your environment super clean. But number two, it's a training vehicle. So I've seen times where a single developer probably tried to deploy a server 10 times, 15, 20 times overnight, and we deleted it 20 times. Send them the email, and they complain, and it's like, well, did you read the email? You're not encrypting your VM, so you got to go back and fix it. And initially, that type of automation sparks a lot of noise, but over time, it diminishes down to nothing, and all of a sudden you have an environment that knows how to follow the rules. And then think about doing automation like that, but think about parity too, right? One of the 12 factors. Non-prod is just as important as prod. Enforce non-prod, because if you can comply in non-prod, then getting to prod is an easy hurdle, right? It's a low bar. You already know how to be compliant.
Right.
If you only do that type of thing in prod, then your non-prod environments are a mess, number one. Number two, it's a big change to get to production, and it's difficult to achieve compliance. One more thing I'll say about automation is, even if you have all of those auto remediation preventative type controls, it's important to monitor anyway. The environment changes constantly, and especially at scale, and things happen. There's edge cases. An API limit could stop your auto remediation from running and deleting something that should have been deleted, and all of a sudden you have a violation in your environment. Things happen. You have to augment that auto remediation with good monitoring control. Everything you auto remediate, you should be monitoring 100% coverage, because what you'll find is there'll be gaps. All of a sudden something will slip through, and you'll see it, and you'll send the team. So go research why this EC2 exists without encryption. And then they'll go look at it, and they'll say, oh, well, somebody deployed it in safe mode and disabled the delete API, and our auto remediation didn't catch it, didn't stop it. So then you have to go back and change your code and add the delete API before you delete something. So just nuances happen. So auto remediation and monitoring work together. They're twins, to be honest with you, and they're essential. But that's kind of the automation I think about.
And I think basically what you're saying is there are a lot of moving parts in cloud, and it's virtually impossible to manually monitor each moving part. So it's we have to automate 99%, or to an extent, whatever automation we can put, we have to automate everything in cloud. But you have touched upon the SaaS, and we discussed this offline as well. And it's also a scary thing for you and for any cloud security expert. How difficult it is it like SaaS, and is it that we have to worry too much about using the SaaS platforms or SaaS based applications in cloud?
Yeah. So SaaS is a challenge, and it's a growing challenge. and more companies are building SaaS security teams. And historically, SaaS security was typically just contract review, right? You would review the terms of the contract and get everybody to agree on certain things. But as time goes on and as more and more dependency grows on SaaS, beyond like G Suite and Office 365 and those major SaaS providers. But when you start thinking of what we're doing with Salesforce or ServiceNow or Box.com or Workday and some of these mega SaaS providers where you're putting tons of your data into these environments. What is the risk and what's, and how is that data being protected from one day to the next? These SaaS providers are using the cloud just like we all are. And the ephemeral nature of our clouds that challenge our security challenge them too.
Right.
So it's not like you can just set it and forget it. You have to set it and try and monitor it somehow. So how do you build a good SaaS security? One of the things I focus on is looking for a tool that does some kind of compliance monitoring of the SaaS environment. Now,
okay,
what tools do that? I don't want to name vendors, but there's not many, but there's some. And the vendors that do it do a real good job with it. So what I would recommend is if you're worried about SaaS, I would look for some way to monitor those environments with automation. And I would prioritize based on risk. Typically, a large enterprise company will have hundreds and hundreds of SaaS providers. And if you look at CASB logs, you'll see it. But they're not all equal in terms of size and risk, right? Some of them are much larger than others. Focus on risk and build a team that monitors that. They can be looking at CASB output. They can be monitoring traffic at proxies. You can identify which SaaS providers you're using. That capability exists. You could do that with homegrown tools. You can build databases and you can create all kinds of metrics and scorecards around that. But then once you've identified where your biggest risk is, how do you get in there and check it? And that's where third-party tooling comes into place. And that's what I've been focused on. And I think more and more companies are starting to look at that as well.
So along with the tools, Chris, I think the contractual part still would be there, right? Because we
don't
know.
Yeah, you're not going to not do the contracts, right? Contracts is important,
right.
Absolutely important. But the tools will augment that.
Okay. I think the real risk starts, like you said, if a SaaS provider having their own cloud, and then they might have given our data to some other SaaS provider as part of the plugin in their cloud. So it's a never-ending chain, right?
Yeah, or they might put your data in a bucket or something, or they might have a public API accessibility. You could configure something to be publicly accessible through some URL. I know some SaaS providers do that, and I know sometimes things are configured inappropriately, and you wouldn't even know it, but your data is available over the internet through a URL, similar to an S3 bucket or a blob storage bucket or something along those lines. So yeah, that exposure exists, and like I said, it happens. It's ephemeral, and it happens quickly and it happens often, and you can't just look at and set it once and just think it's going to be statically secure forever. That's not the case, right? It changes constantly,
right?
Just like your own environment. So let me just throw out one other side.
Sure. Yeah.
Topic. And something I do face a lot in cloud security is when you leverage third-party SaaS providers in your own cloud to do things, like tools, as an example.
Like Splunk.
Yes, it could be Splunk, or it could be typically Splunk you're running on yourself, but it could be other SaaS.
New Relic or right.
Yeah, New Relic or Datadog. Or, I don't want to go through and mention all these different tools, but what I've been challenged with is that oftentimes people want to bring SaaS tools in and provide access to third parties via credentials. But the access goes beyond read access. So sometimes they'll ask for the ability to go in and delete stuff, or create and delete stuff, or create, delete, and have access to your keys to create a snapshot of a VM, for instance. And if the VM's encrypted, they're going to want to decrypt it to create a snapshot and create another VM. So those type of functions bring a lot of risk. So now you've said that, all right, everybody at this third-party SaaS provider has the ability to go into your environment and delete something across the board, everywhere. So you're relying on the employees, you're relying on the integrity of the environment at that third party. If they get compromised or whatever, then that potentially could come to you. It's something you should think about and carefully evaluate the permissions that you grant third-party SaaS providers from a tooling perspective into your cloud environment. I think that's important, and it's something I definitely focus in on. Read access is one thing, update access is a different subject.
So this is a fun question, Chris. Besides too much caffeine, right? What keeps you awake? I know, because since you are in the leadership role, most of the time, if something happens in a company, you are pretty much, you're putting yourself in the risk, and that happens with all bigger CISO roles, right? So what keeps you awake at night besides your coffee?
I mean, everything that we've been talking about keeps me awake at night. Making sure foundational controls, baseline controls are clearly identified and compliance to those. That's one area that I really focus in on. I'm definitely a risk-based leader, so I always look at things from a risk perspective. So what is the highest risk configurations that I need to worry about? Local users with MFA, without MFA, that's a high risk topic, or access keys that don't rotate and change periodically, especially if they're on privileged accounts. Those things keep me up at night. Sometimes exceptions keep me up at night, depending on what the exception is and what the ramifications are. I will say that in the cloud, the areas that I do tend to worry about the most is internet connectivity, right? So when you connect to the internet from the cloud, and typically you have, an N-tier architecture where you have WAFs and you have CDNs passing data and traffic to WAFs, and you have WAFs passing traffic down to web servers or gateways or something along those lines. How are you making sure that's all being managed and controlled appropriately? Where is that data? Where is that traffic being authenticated? And how are you segmenting and isolating that authentication from your data? So architectural designs, I guess, is the best way to describe that. So the architectural design components of cloud keep me up at night. And then having the right team, building teams, having the right level of expertise, that's also a challenge that I worry about. So in a multi-cloud environment, typically if it's a big enterprise, they're going to use AWS, they're going to use Google, they're going to use Azure, right? All three. Making sure you have the right talent to focus on all three of those, independent of each other, right? So when you think of Google and constraints and the firewalls and the shared VPC model, then you go to Azure and Azure policies and subscriptions and resource groups and how that's being managed, or AWS at the account level, and you worry about everything from service control policies all the way down to IAM and security groups and how you manage all of that defense in depth stuff. You need expertise. It just doesn't come naturally. It's hard, and you need to hire the right people with the right knowledge to put the right focus. That keeps me up at night. But other than that, I try to sleep really good. Alcohol helps.
So caffeine and alcohol. Caffeine keeps you awake and alcohol keeps you asleep. So
a good bottle of Pinot Noir, yeah.
So the future of cloud security, Chris, I think now there are a lot of people who know security very well, or they are familiar with the data center security, or the CISSP experts and audit experts. But what do you think is the future for people who want to get into the cloud security area? Is it growing according to you, Chris, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's growing for sure. And it's growing in many ways. So I'm a hardcore architecture IaaS type security professional, but there's also security professionals in the SOC, right? They need to know what to monitor and what to look for in the cloud, right? Yeah. There's security areas in the hygienes or endpoint management, right? And how wrapping your hands around API management. There's cloud security professionals around vulnerability management, whether you use image-based agents or your new network scanners, but the scanning everything and getting line of sight into vulnerabilities in the cloud is complex. It's not straightforward. Then as you move into container environments and scanning containers either during CI or during, dynamically at runtime, during runtime, these things are complicated, right? And cloud specific technology and cloud specific knowledge is very, very in demand. And I see it all the time. Certainly what I do around how you configure infrastructure and how you configure and manage environments, as I described earlier, there's a demand for that, absolutely. And the technologies, we're still dealing with the big three, the Googles, the Azures, and the AWSs, but there's other vendors, there's other cloud service providers that are coming up, right? Whether it be Alibaba or the IBMs or the Oracles. I mean, again, they're all kind of unique. I mean, they're all considered the same in terms of their VMs on hypervisors. They're all kind of constructed the same way, but the mechanics around it, they're all different. And there's ample opportunity for people to get involved in that. The company you work for, if you're interested, understand what their cloud footprint is, what their cloud play is, where are they going. And then there's self-training. You can go and get self-training on the internet, right? There's
right.
websites you can go to. Pluralsight and A Cloud Guru is something I've used through my career. Train yourself up. You can get a free account on your personal machine. I wouldn't advocate doing it on a work machine, but certainly on a personal machine, get a free account, train yourself up, and go take a test. Go get certified. And when I say certified, don't get certified as a practitioner. Well, you can if you want. Go as a practitioner, but that's typically not going to be a technical challenge. Go get certified as an architect. If you can pass one of those certification tests, and you know yourself, have a baseline of knowledge on how things work. There's no way you can pass these tests. I just had to get recertified in AWS a couple of weeks ago. The level of detail of those questions, it's impossible. I guess it's not impossible. If you're super lucky, you can pass. But unless you know that stuff, there's no way you're going to be able to pass. But anyway, once you're certified, now you have a badge of honor, right? Now you can demonstrate to your own company that, hey, I know how this stuff works to a certain degree. And then don't be afraid to go into entry-level positions. If you're a coder or have even inklings of coding, get involved in Python. I mean, start writing code. It's super simple. Get yourself your own account in one of the cloud providers and start writing code. Get familiar with APIs. They all have tons and tons of documentation available on the internet around the APIs and the API constructs. Get a CLI or an SDK on your laptop. Start building some code. Write some code. Get used to it. Make yourself marketable. Put that on your resume. That's what I look for. I look for people who have that experience that know how to do these type of things.
Thank you, Chris.
Anyway.
So besides the basic security knowledge, I think what you have been saying for this whole podcast is that automation is key in the cloud security. So you have to know how to code, especially at least using Python or PowerShell or basically any programming language, but at least know how to code and automate the stuff in cloud. Okay. So how to get into the cloud security from a traditional security? Because there are a lot of people who have many years of experience in a traditional security and on-premise security maybe. For them, what would you suggest if they want to get into the cloud security area?
Yeah, so if you have a lot of experience, which is, I did too, right? So if I look at my career, I did security for 18 years before I got into cloud. So I had tons of on-prem security. But the thing about it is security is one thing, and security is not the panacea here. It's more around automation. It's more around thinking automation. It's more around having that kind of in your DNA. It's less around general security knowledge. Unless you're doing something like policies or you're looking at regulatory compliance and things along those lines. But in an operational mode, in a cloud security role, you really need to think automation. So if you're in a traditional security role, you should be thinking about how to automate. What are the methods of automation? What can you automate? What's the opportunities for automation? Where do you automate? Study that, learn it, understand it.
Okay.
You think of a cloud. And from a cloud perspective, look at the CSA framework, right? The reference architecture for Cloud Security Alliance is excellent, right? And I use it. But look at those areas, right? IAM, the network. And then when you understand the cloud, how would you automate some of these things? What in IAM is interesting? What would I want to automate? How would I want to look at IAM? Do I want to look at every user that hasn't logged in, that has an access key? Yeah, probably. Do I want to look at any users without MFA? Yep. Do I want to look at SaaS accounts and who from a third party can gain access into my environment? Yep. But you start thinking about hypothetical what ifs or early warning or exception reports, and that's where your opportunities to automate are. And typically when I hire engineers, I spend a lot of time, building backlog items, using Jira, and I typically use an agile approach, but backlogging where the automation is required, and then grooming that backlog, all the time, looking at it and making sure I manage priorities. The company may want to enable a particular service that's not enabled, and they want to do it like yesterday. Well, all of a sudden, now I got to shift my automation to focus on that one service, right? I want to make sure I have auto remediation in place before we enable it, as an example. But yeah, knowing how to automate, what to automate, when to automate, and where to automate in the cloud, I think is the key. So if you're a security professional, think that way. Force that into your mind. Take the training, become technical, brush up your technical skills. If you're not a technical person, struggle through it. You can do it. I did it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. So, here I am as an executive director and, taking certification exams. If I can do it, you could do it. It's not beyond anybody's capability.
I mean, that's awesome, Chris. You don't have to do certifications, given your skills and, the position that you are currently at CVS. But still you are doing that. And like you said, if you are doing that, in spite of having very little time to prepare for certification, then nobody should have any excuse for, not doing certification.
I don't want to put too much weight on certification. I'm just saying when you get certified, you understand how you're doing.
The fundamentals.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily need to get certified because of my level and what I'm doing. But I also know that, maybe tomorrow I might want to write a Lambda function in AWS to look at something. So I want to be able to do that too. So it's key. The clouds themselves change all the time too. So maintaining certification will make sure that you keep up to speed on some of these base services. So getting certified, wow, I don't know how many years ago, 6 years ago, and getting recertified 2 weeks ago. Quite different in terms of the questions. Quite different in terms of the questions that were being asked. It's not the same. It's changing constantly.
Yeah, even I have to get certified because all my certifications are expired, and I'm slacking. So you are an inspiration for me now. I have to go back.
There you go.
All right, Chris.
Well,
thank you so much.
On the side, we can talk about what some of those questions were. I can kind of give you a tip. There was a lot of new stuff, a lot of new services in AWS that you need to know, be aware of.
Okay. With that, I think thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your wealth of knowledge on cloud security. And I hope people who are watching this have at least understood what they have to do and what they have to learn to get into cloud security. So if you have any questions, let us know in the comment section. I'll try to answer them, or if not, I will direct to Chris. But thank you so much, Chris. And it's awesome to have you here. And it was a pleasure talking to you.
Well, you're welcome. And it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And we can come back and talk about some other topics in the future if you like.
That's awesome, Chris. Thank you.